The real danger of AI is not that we're going to be replaced by machines, but that we're going to start treating each other like machines. What is reality? How do we know what is real? It turns out that that's actually a very difficult question. Our brains cannot experience the universe except through sensorium. I think fundamentally, right, when people are falling in love with AI, what's really happening here is they're really engaged in an act of reflection, of falling in love with aspects of themselves or their own imagination. For large parts of Western history, people who viewed the companionship of imaginary beings as being more valuable than real humans were lauded as saints, not as somehow dystopian. This modern trend towards viewing romantic love as the ultimate fulfillment of all of our emotional needs is deeply troubling. Ask yourself, does this use of AI make me feel more human or less so? The question isn't about mechanism. The question is about meaning. I call this the brain of Theseus, right? It's like the ship of Theseus. It's the same sort of philosophical thought experiment to sort of get people into imagining how they could actually imagine themselves being uploaded.
Today's guest is Ken Liu, an award-winning author whose work has inspired many, including Pantheon, a cult cartoon which is blowing minds in Silicon Valley. Ken was both a software engineer and a technology patent lawyer before going full-time with fiction. We discuss the singularity, consciousness, dreams, psychedelics, and what it means to be human in the age of AI. I remember being a sophomore at Stanford, and I took this class called Sleep and Dreams, and it's a lot about how humans sleep and how to optimize it. But there's also, they go into just like what dreaming is to humankind. And one of my big takeaways was, oh, dreams actually have no significance. And that's kind of what they teach you is we can't explain them. We don't know where they're come from, but it would be a fallacy to evoke meaning from them.
I think there are always two levels of explanations, right? So, you might as well ask the same question of many other things. Like, for example, what is the purpose of romantic love? Is there a purpose? I mean, you can explain that by saying, well, fundamentally, this is an evolutionary trait. It's something selected by evolution because this kind of pair bonding instinct is, helpful for producing offspring. And so those who feel these feelings are more successful than those who do not in terms of reproductive success. And so there's your explanation. But these explanations are fundamentally unsatisfying, right? Because they are not actually interesting. It's sort of like the question really isn't about that. The question isn't about mechanism. The question is about meaning. And meaning is not actually something that I argue can fundamentally be explained by mechanistic means. Why do we have meaning? Why do we find meaning in certain things? You can explain that by saying, well, it's an evolutionary thing, and consciousness is evolutionarily explainable. But this kind of explanation is not fundamentally what we're really looking for, right? So this goes back to the question earlier about knowability, right? It's possible for us to explain in great detail the mechanism of dreaming. This is what the brain is doing. This is where the signals come from. This is why you have these images. But in the end, you still have no actual explanation. This is my fundamental problem with a lot of the explanations, which is they explain almost everything while explaining nothing. Because what we're trying to explain here is, why do people believe in stories? Why do people find life worthwhile? Why do we not just give up? Why do we actually do the things we do? And the explanation can't just be because your genes want to reproduce. That explanation is not actually interesting to anyone. It may be fundamentally true in a scientific sense, but it's not true in a dream logic or teleological meaning or spiritual sense. And we do actually crave those meanings. Honestly, most of human life is structured around stories like that, stories that have no rational meaning. I mean, why do modern states ask citizens to die for them all the time? Because for a story, for the sake of a story. We are willing to die for the sake of a story. In fact, it's the only thing that humans have ever willingly died for. And that's very profound. I do want people to think about that. We do not really die for rational reasons. We die ultimately for the sake of a story. And stories have meaning for us, and we have to examine what those meanings are. And ultimately, meanings come out of dream country, not rational explanations.
Yeah. And on that concept of like science or an atoms based world or these things being able to explain everything and nothing at all, I think about this a lot when it comes to how there's like these perfect patterns throughout nature that can be explained, but they're almost like too perfect. And then also through our own natural intelligence as humans that I still think we don't fully understand. Like we're building artificial intelligence and there's such deep natural intelligence that humans have. Um, and I'm just curious how you think about that. If
You're absolutely right. I mean, fundamentally, right, the question of consciousness is extremely interesting to me, right? Why do we have consciousness? How is it caused? Can we even explain this thing that we call consciousness? I mean, if you think about consciousness, it's truly a very interesting thing. It's the means by which we know the universe. Whatever knowing means to you, right? We this sense of me, the sense of me experiencing the universe is foundational to our existence. And yet we don't really understand what this is. In fact, even the states of consciousness are mysterious to us, right? When you use chemical substances to alter your state of consciousness, you often feel very different than you do in these sober states, right? In the states in which you feel like this individual, this self, sense. But that's not the only way to experience consciousness. Those of us who have experimented know that it is possible to have consciousness without a deep sense of ego, the sense of being a consciousness of the universe. A lot of chemicals induce that state. And it's interesting to think about, why is it our consciousness is like this, not like that all the time?
totally.
And what, yeah,
And why are
go
there
ahead.
these often naturally occurring substances sprinkled throughout the physical world that let our brains get to these other places and see things so clearly in a just totally different lens? To me, that's
Right,
wild.
and yeah, it's wild biologically to think about the fact that there are these plants or animals that have evolved to have these chemicals that can have such states on us. How did that happen? Why? How is this explainable? Not explainable in the sense of just a purely mechanistic thing, but even there's a lot of mysteries. Like, what is the evolutionary explanation for this? What is the just the foundational chemistry of what's happening here? It's deeply fascinating. But consciousness ultimately is incredibly interesting, right? I think historically in sci-fi, we've sort of imagined that intelligence and consciousness are almost equivalent, in the sense that if you have intelligence, you automatically have consciousness, or the two cannot be separable. But I think if we had reflected on this a little deeper, we would have realized that's not true. But AI is making us more and more aware of this distinction, right? If you're talking about intelligence, what is intelligence? Well, you can measure many ways. You can have an IQ test. You can ask somebody to write an essay to explain, to demonstrate their learning. You can ask someone to play a game of chess. You can ask someone to analyze and do a mathematical proof. These are all forms of intelligence. Now, it turns out that these large language models can do all or some version of this, often quite successfully, even more successfully than humans can. And yet, I think the vast majority of humans would agree that these models are not conscious. So here's an example where consciousness and intelligence are decoupled. And it's a very strange feeling to realize that they are fundamentally different things. And what are we really valuing? And what are we talking about when we talk about consciousness? I find the question deeply fascinating. And I think it's one of those things where we have moved to the moment in our own evolutionary history where we have to answer this question. um, we really have to find an answer to this question, like, what is consciousness and how do we know we have consciousness? Because ethically, we are in a moment where we have to actually answer some of these questions just to make real decisions, right? There's two trends that I see in the modern world that are sort of pushing up against each other. One is the development of artificial intelligence, right? Um, at some point, we either will, by accident or on purpose, stumble into conscious artificial consciousness, not merely artificial intelligence. But how will we know? I mean, to ask simply, people now laugh when someone claims that ChatGPT is conscious, but how will we ever know when that actually has happened? And do we not think that that will happen at some point? I think a lot of us now are not so sure about this. In the moment when we have created artificial consciousness, how will we know when that has happened? Because to me, that is an important ethical moment where we have to decide what we can and can't do. Shutting down a model that merely has intelligence is one thing. Shutting down a model that has consciousness is something quite different. We do need to think about what that means. The other trend is, the research into the seed of consciousness in our brains. We're getting closer and closer to the moment where we can isolate exactly how the human brain produces consciousness, or perhaps we could say the human body. Uh, and once we figure that out, we will be able to replicate that using other substrate. And if we are doing that, again, how will we know when we have succeeded? How will we know we actually have done this thing? So, to me, understanding what consciousness is a critical question. We are running up against this moment where very deep ethical questions have to be answered depending on how, what we understand about this question.
I mean, Ken, you're taking us right into this sort of next chapter of the podcast that I wanted to cover. First of all, one thing I want to just like give you props for is I think in your stories you do an amazing job at the reader generates like real empathy for both the humans and the machines in the story. And I think writing with that nuance and that level of nuance is not easy because we come in with a specific set of views. And I think there are so many movies and TV shows out there right now that pretty much always just make like the robot child the devil, or like there's 50 different forums where it's like dystopia and technology is the issue. And even in Pantheon, it's very different. You have like a lot of love for the like fully computer machine character in that. Okay, so one question is this idea that we could upload our minds and take a human consciousness, put it into a computer, a server, a chip. I can't, like, I think about it and I can't fathom it, like, in the sense that I think we could easily make a Sabrina model and ingest everything about me, and it would probably sound like me, talk like me, think like me, and it's probably going to be smarter than I really am. But then taking like this completely unknown thing of consciousness and replicating that in technology is just so hard for me to wrap my head around. Like when you dream about it and think about it, like what is that? Can you see it? I guess you can.
It's a difficult question, and I think fundamentally whether you believe that is possible or not is a metaphysical question as well as, an actual scientific question. I think they're both. So let me try to take you through a thought experiment and see if that would help you a little bit. So suppose that suppose you one day discover that uh, your a part of your brain has a certain flaw such that your visual processing is no longer working as well as it should. Okay, so let's just suppose that happened. Suppose that our medical technology has advanced to the point where we can now replace your visual processing center, the parts of the brain that does visual processing, with essentially a computer chip. Okay, and you voluntarily undergo this particular procedure so that now you have a computer chip serving the same function as what your visual cortex used to do. Now, this is not that science fictional. This is actually eminently doable. We already know that artificial neural networks trained to recognize faces actually represent faces in largely the same way our brain does does so. So it is not a wild stretch to imagine this being effective. So would you not say that after the procedure you wake up, you're still you? You don't think that somehow you have died and being replaced by a clone, right? Would that be accurate?
Yes.
Okay. So suppose now that something else happened and now your brain is suffering some form of motor nerve control issue such that the motor cortex of your brain has to be replaced by a computer chip to send signals out. So you undergo the same procedure. Would you not agree that after you wake up you're still you're still conscious, you're the same person as you were before?
Yes.
Okay, so I think you can carry on this experiment until you get to somewhere, let's just hypothetically speaking, that most of your brain has now been replaced by computer chips, but there is still a little part. Let's call that part the column of neurons that basically instantiates your sense of self. We don't know exactly where that is, but we think it exists because whatever your thoughts are, there's a physical representation in the brain for that. I mean, thoughts are not mystical things, they actually exist. So suppose that you're at the point where your brain is largely made up of computer chips, except for that column of neurons. You still would think, I think, that you're Sabrina, that you would not feel like you're somehow no longer you, like you're still you. And now suppose that we do the last bit where we have figured out how those neurons work, and we're going to replace those neurons with another computer chip. So now you're 100% made up of computer chips. I think, I don't know how most people feel about this, but I think a large proportion of the population would say that when you wake up, you're still you. I mean, what do you think? Like after this last procedure, would you still say you're you?
Yeah.
Okay, so I call this the brain of Theseus, right? It's like the ship of Theseus. It's the same sort of philosophical thought experiment to sort of get people into imagining how they could actually imagine themselves being uploaded. I I think that is plausible. I think that is believable, and I think if you go through that entire procedure, it just seems to me that I would still feel like I am who I am. Now, I can easily imagine somebody saying that no, it just doesn't work that way. Like, what if you, instead of doing replacement of brains, you just sort of copy parts of your brain into silicon so that you end up with a copy of you, like a silicon Sabrina? I can easily imagine that the silicon Sabrina would think that the silicon Sabrina is a continuation of you. And you would say that, no, that's not true. That's just a copy of me. I think that's a moment of metaphysicality. I mean, Greg Egan has written about this sort of thing extensively in his fiction, but I, I think whether you think you're a continuation of you is in some ways a metaphysical question that's not answerable. I mean, there are philosophers who think that when you go to sleep and you wake up, you're actually a different person. That you died when you went to sleep and you're waking up a different person. I think a lot of us would reject that premise, but I can see how you could accept that. I mean, you could argue that every time you go to sleep, you wake up a different person. In fact, every time you lose consciousness or even have a daydream, you wake up a different person. Because continuity is just one aspect of thinking about the self. It's not all there is to it. So anyway, I don't want to get too far afield, but you see, there's a lot of very interesting questions
Totally.
to ask here.
Yeah. And that kind of makes me wonder two things. One, I guess one reason I believe I would still be so conscious is because I have this like personal story of who I am in this way. And I wonder, like, to seed fully conscious technology, do, does it need to have its own personal story in a sense, or like be birthed into the world with a point of view in a sense? I don't even know what that would look like. But um and also on the other side, if people feel we're already like just seeing the beginning of this world where humans feel like their greatest companion is a model or whatever it is. um I wonder if like those same ethical questions start coming to light when people feel like their greatest companion on this earth is something that is not human. Like, how do we treat it? Even the way when OpenAI is folding its models into the newest version, there are people that are upset. This is just like the very beginning, but you start seeing once people are just completely attached, like, does that give it, more inherent value, and how we treat it, how we change it, how we regulate it? I
Yeah,
don't know, but
I mean, I can talk a little bit about it because I think you raised some
yeah.
really interesting questions here. I guess okay. So I think oftentimes when we speak about how men and women are falling in love with ChatGPT, somehow we view that as a dystopian thing. I'm not sure we should jump to the conclusion that's dystopian, because I think these questions are worth examining in a little more depth. So I want people to think about the fact that for large parts of Western history, people who viewed the companionship of imaginary beings as being more valuable than real humans were lauded as saints, not as somehow dystopian, right? If you went to become a bride of Christ and you believe that your deepest relationship is with God, for much of the history of the West, that was seen as a wonderful thing, that you were actually a better human being than those who were obsessed with other humans. It's worth bringing that back and keeping that in mind, and realize that this idea that we want to engage with reflections of our own minds or imaginary versions of our minds, whatever you want to call it, is not something new in our history. It's something that has very deep historical roots, and we have not always viewed these relationships as negative. I think what bothers me often is this modern knee-jerk reaction to treating these relationships as somehow dystopian feels to me ahistorical. They feel to me deeply rooted in a post-enlightenment vision of what humans mean to each other and what the ideal human life ought to be, when there's no reason to think that somehow this is the only possible answer. um, I think fundamentally, right, when people are falling in love with AI, what's really happening here is I think a lot of people do not believe that ChatGPT is conscious. They do not believe that they're engaged with a another consciousness. They're really engaged in an act of reflection, of falling in love with aspects of themselves or their own imagination. Again, as I said, historically, we have not always treated instances of that as somehow bad. We have not treated them as negative. And it's worth asking why we sort of jump to the conclusion that's bad automatically in the present moment. I'm not advocating somehow people, go out and find AI boyfriends or whatever. I'm just saying we need to think about exactly what is happening here, and reflect deeply on what the meaning of these stories are for the people who are doing this, and view everything through the lens of empathy and compassion and understanding and curiosity, rather than just jump to the conclusion of we know that this is bad.
Totally. I couldn't agree with you more. I think where it comes from is this idea that what happened in the past was better, and it's like the exemplification of a world that is like more and more living through our screens, and humans aren't really connecting or meeting in person. But the truth is we already built this world, and yet there's a lot of lonely people in it. So like, does it actually make people happier? And then I think the only viewpoint with which people could look at it and be like, oh, this is bad, is maybe if you view things through an evolutionary perspective of like, humans need to procreate, and right now you can't procreate with a model, right? That might not even be the case in 100 years, because we have such interesting fertility tech stuff happening that like there's a lot. I think that's like a whole next phase of change in the physical world that will like actually really start changing these I think it's going to be very interesting when like you don't need a woman to carry a baby and all this stuff, how things change. But I would say that's like one of the arguments against it is birth rate decline, and you can't build a family and that's so fulfilling in life and things like that. But there's also a world where like maybe you have all these companions in different forms, and then you have a physical romantic partner, but they don't have to fulfill you in every single way. They don't have to validate you in every single way, right? There's a really interesting world where more parts of you are seen or um, are fed in a way that maybe one person can't give you all of that.
I would argue that this modern trend towards viewing romantic love as the ultimate fulfillment of all of our emotional needs is deeply troubling, and in fact perhaps unhealthy. Again, throughout much of human history, that was not how we imagined it. It used to be that people thought about the possibility of emotional labor and emotional satisfaction coming from multiple sources: your extended family, your extended network. Not your romantic partner does not have to be everything to you all at once. That may be a very strange modern conception that we should do a lot to examine, and perhaps think about why we told stories that led to this. I mean, I obviously we can study, sociological and historically how this vision came to be, but we shouldn't accept that just because that's the story we're telling at the moment. It's the only story worth telling. We have not always told the story, and it doesn't have to be that way. And you brought us something really interesting, which is this idea of um, perhaps having your perhaps it's healthier to have your emotional needs met in a variety of different ways. I think that's very true. I mean, we're already doing that, right? I mean, part of what capitalism has done is, in fact, to take us. Historically, we humans have lived as embedded creatures in deep social networks, meaning we are parts of clans and families and lineages. And that was historically where we found our meaning. You could argue that the birth of modernity, of what we think of as modernity, came out of, depending on your preferred sociological text, the rise of capitalism, or the rise of the nation state, or the rise of even preferences for marriages outside of the clan. Whatever your preferred explanation is, it is true that in the modern age, we now try to encourage individuals to find meaning and connections not from the accidents of their birth, but by accomplishments or by active acts of seeking, which is why, there's this obsession we have that marriages that are done out of choice are better than marriages done out of arrangement. The literature on whether people are actually happier as a result of this is very mixed. It is not clear that people are actually happier as a result of being able to choose their own marriage partners, which I think is one of the great
Yeah.
ironies.
I do believe, and I watched something that you a podcast you went on, and you kind of speak of this idea of like current modernity and the modern world. There's some sense in which everyone is encouraged to escape to something bigger or different or separate, and I couldn't agree with that more. And it just relates to this idea of like we have almost infinite possibility to design our life. And it's like the paradox of choice. And it's this idea that everyone should strive for this exceptional, larger than life, when it's like, what are the things that actually bring fulfillment? And this goes back to the concept of how important the stories that are told are. America specifically, both for good and bad, values that individual that reaches unbelievable heights more than like I feel like the collective in a way. And so it's definitely an interesting mix of ingredients. Okay, one more thing I wanted to ask you about is there's a story of Elon Musk going to dinner with Larry Page, and they're talking about AI and how it could play out, and Larry Page accuses him of being a speciesist, which is basically like, oh, you value human life above all other existences and lives. And that encouraged Elon to go build the team around OpenAI and fund it, basically saying like, oh shit, this is coming, and I want to build a version of it where like humans are preserved. And in your stories, there's this tension between those who choose the path of preservation versus the path of transformation. There's all these themes. Like, I guess, do you believe a human life is inherently more valuable than the versions of existence that we could create in the future? Where do you lie on that spectrum? If in 20 years we can all have a brain computer interface, would you hop on that path and it's safe? Would you be on the train to input it?
Yeah.
These
Oh
are two
boy.
different questions, I guess, but they're in the same realm of just like
Yeah.
speaking of designing our lives.
These are incredibly difficult questions. Actually, I don't know if I have good answers for them, because I feel like the reality is that I won't be able to answer these questions until the moment comes. Right. I think this is something that we all sort of acknowledge, which is how we answer something in the abstract is very different versus how we actually answer it in the moment it comes. People might think, oh, I'm going to be so brave, I'm going to be so awesome. But then when actually faced with the moment of choice, a lot of us end up freezing, or we do the thing that we thought we would be ashamed, or vice versa. A lot of us think that in the abstract, we wouldn't have the courage to do something. But when the moment happens, we do. Like parents find out this all the time, that they think, oh, I may not be able to rise to the challenge to defend my child the way that they deserve to be defended. But when the moment comes, some of us find that we actually have more courage than we thought we would, that somehow we can do it. So it goes both ways. And I think it's like that. I think, you're asking me, what would I do? Concretely speaking, I don't know until that moment happens, when I'm faced with that choice, and then I'll know. In terms of whether human life actually is, the most important or the most valuable, I would say, in the abstract, I can't possibly make that statement. I just can't. I can easily imagine a future in which, um, you know, the decision that we make now about what lives we find to be more valuable. Already it's complicated. Oftentimes it depends on how close we are to somebody. Often depends on how much practically we think we can make a difference. It depends on, in terms of how we value animals, it depends on our vision of their capacity for suffering.
Yeah, I do
There's
think
a
there's
reason.
a chance, by the way, that I should be vegetarian, and there's something that I'm like, I think there's a chance that we just choose to put blinders on, but it could be like the greatest crime of all time that like we eat animals every day. But
Yes, absolutely. I think there's a very realistic possibility that in the same way that we look back on past societies and say, how could they possibly have tolerated something like this for hundreds of years? It's unbelievable. It's very possible that in the future our descendants will look back on us and say, how could these people have killed billions of chickens every single year like this? How could they have just kept these animals in these conditions and being blind to their suffering? I think it's very plausible that someday our descendants will look on us and judge us very harshly for this, and we don't even think about it. But in terms of whether we will value artificial beings, yes, I think this is why the question of what is consciousness is so important. If we can figure out what that actually is, and know for sure that some of our creations actually experience consciousness, I think we will need to worry about whether we should value these artificial beings any less than beings of evolution. The biosphere always ends up giving birth to the technosphere, but technosphere beings, ethically, I don't see how they should have any less of a claim for our consideration than biological beings. And when that day comes, we will have to think very hard about what does it mean to preserve an artificial life? What does it mean to actually value artificial consciousness? And all the attendant ethical questions that come out of that.
yeah, and as you foreshadowed through your thought experiment you walked me through, I think the lines of what makes a human human will get increasingly blurry. So, one thing I wanted to ask you is you are a writer, and the labs in San Francisco, they have teams. I know OpenAI has a team focused on creating and building really good creative writing models. And obviously, there are 101 companies building insane coding agents, and you go across the board, right? A lot of these technical skills of craft might not be needed. And I'm curious, who do you think holds the pen in the future of the human story?
Yeah, this is a very difficult question, and in fact, it's a question that's being actively debated right now. I mean, I would argue that this is a question that's being actively debated throughout history, right? Um, so I would not start from there. So let me again take you back to a historical moment, right? So um, Plato, had a very strong argument against writing, and he basically said that when people adopt the technology of writing, they really are losing their humanity because they're losing a very important technical skill, which is memory and oral argumentation rhetoric, right? So he's saying that when you go to books, written books, you are convinced that by reading the words on the page you understood what the writer meant, but in reality we know that's not true, right? So I know this to be a fact, right? People often read something and they come up with the wildest interpretations, but it's different when you speak with the person who wrote something. If you have a chance to interrogate them and ask them and go back and forth, you end up eventually settling on something that's much closer to a common understanding than if you were just reading the words by themselves. This is why the profession of law is so strange. We often argue about the intent of the drafters, and we go back and forth about what do these words actually mean, when in fact the only way to ascertain the intent in a deep philosophical sense is to speak with the person, go back and forth until you can ascertain that intention. There's no other way to do it. um, so, would you agree then that we are all somehow lesser human beings because we're such a literate culture? We're a culture that relies on writing as opposed to the oral culture that Plato was discussing, where the primary means of knowledge gathering is debate and discussion, not reading someone else's writing, and that we had to actually rely on our memory to do a lot of work rather than just trusting on the fact that we can go look things up. I think most of us would say, well, that was a technical skill that we lost. We don't exercise our memory in that way anymore, and rhetoric is not nearly as important orally as it used to be. But we don't think we're less human beings. We think we ended up being wonderful human beings despite our reliance on this technology. So I suspect that that's very similar to how this debate will go. There are those of us who argue that the technical skills are not separable from the art that we're doing. That is, if you don't have the technical skills to paint, to draw, to animate, you actually can't call yourself a filmmaker or whatever. That the technical skills are not separable from the way you tell a story. That is, it is not possible to be a great storyteller whose way of telling a story is to tell an assistant to do the job of actually creating that story. But then again, right, I would challenge that a little bit by saying that, well, the reality is a lot of our most popular authors write in exact that manner. There are some writers today who are very popular who do not write their own books. They work with collaborators, and their job is to make an outline or to tell the collaborator what the story is and have the collaborator write it. Is that very different from people who write with ChatGPT? I'm not sure it is all that different. Now, being the sort of writer I am, I have an instinctive belief that the technical skills are in fact incredibly important for your own artistic vision. That if you do not invent your own language, if you do not actually acquire those skills, you cannot actually do the work. Like, it's sort of like if you're in the tech industry, vibe coding will only get you so far. You have to actually know how this works. If you don't know how to write the code, if you don't know how to solder things together, if you don't actually know fundamentally how these things work, you cannot do the work. You can't. You'll only get so far and then no further. I think that's true of artists, of writers too. You have to actually be able to do this work yourself. Otherwise, you just can't get very far. But the jury is out on that, right? Every time I make that argument, I have to remind myself it is also a fact that many writers today are successful by not writing their own books, but by working with collaborators. So that's not very different from writing with ChatGPT. So I cannot outright and say that that vision will never work. Ultimately, whether that vision will work is going to be something to be determined by the market, because we have chosen to make the market the arbiter of whether something sells artistically, and then we call that the judgment. Now, I personally don't actually think that what sells is equal to what is great art. In fact, plenty of things that will never sell are great art, and plenty of things that do sell are not great art. I don't think those two are equivalent at all. But what is great art is very difficult to define and very different. And historically, we have consistently lost technical skills only to invent new forms of art, new mediums of art that require different kinds of technical skills. So all in all, I'm not that pessimistic as some people tend to be. I don't think that AI will be the end of art as we know it. I think people will figure out what to do with this tool, and people will invent new mediums of art that require different kinds of technical skills and craft. I guess not technical skill. I think a better word for what I'm looking for here is craft. I think people will always invent new realms of craft and skill, and figure out how to best express themselves using that craft.
Yeah. I think if so there's so many examples of what you mentioned, like even the fact that people don't need to memorize the city within they live as much anymore, because you can just use Google Maps so reliably that it's almost like a waste of brain space. But the question is, like, where does that effort go? Does it go into honing something else and something new, or does it go into that extra time when you're walking and not paying attention? Are you also watching TikTok? Like, I think that actually it's like one of those fundamental things of there could be this amazing open spaces that we lean more into, or we can also become like increasingly passive in experience of the world, basically.
I'm with you 100%. So when I get asked this question of, what do I think is a valid use of AI and what do I think is not, my answer is basically what you said, which is, ask yourself, does this use of AI make me feel more human or less so, right? If I'm using AI to do something like answering a business email or trying to figure out an opening on my calendar so I can schedule something. That to me makes me feel more human because I'm no longer doing something that made me feel like a machine. It's a very mechanistic thing that I'm now freed from doing,
And
right? So
there's
that's
no
good.
reason to idealize like really boring, mundane tasks that the modern world requires from us, you know?
Right, exactly. But on the other hand, if I'm using AI in a way so I can be lazy, like if I'm using AI to generate a lesson plan or I'm using AI to create a speech that I'm going to deliver, I would feel bad. I would feel like less human. I would feel like I've given up something that is creative, that is very deeply part of who I am as a human being to a machine. I've outsourced something that is wonderful. I've outsourced my dreams to a machine. I would not feel good about that. And so that's kind of how I draw the line, right? Does this use of AI make me feel more human? Then yes, it's good. If it makes me feel less so, then it's not good, and I should avoid it.
um, I want to get into your recent novel that you released. Congratulations. It's called All
Thank you.
That We See or Seem. Um, I want to ask you, like, what you clearly are a person that has so many important questions and ideas floating around your head and your universe. And what was the inception of this book and this story, and why did you decide to write it? How did it come about?
Okay. So this story came to me in a really wonderful way. It found me rather than the other way around. So basically, this was right after the pandemic when I was thinking very deeply about AI and all the things that we've been talking about. I was thinking very deeply about what does it mean to have AI, be able to tell stories that people read and find meaning. Like I found that very strange, very challenging, right? Meaning making was something essentially human, and if humans are able to read meaning into the gibberish, the jabberings of this machine, then what am I really doing, right? I found it deeply unsettling, and I was trying to figure out what is the future of human art in an age where plenty of customers may prefer machine creations. I mean, we don't know that for sure, but it's one possible future in which plenty of humans will prefer the art created by machines with no meaning behind them versus the kind of thing that we human artists do. And I was worried about that. I was very worried about what does it mean to have meaning making displaced from humans into machines. And then, just as I was thinking about this and writing essays on it, um, Julia Z, the protagonist of All That We See or Seem, showed up out of nowhere, and she was showed up fully formed. She was already angry, already very surly, and as she tends to be. And she came to me and she said, "You are just worried about the wrong things. This is so dumb." And I was like, "What do you mean?" I was taken aback. And she said, "You are worried about the wrong things. This is not what should occupy your time. The real danger of AI is not that we're going to be replaced by machines, but that we're going to start treating each other like machines." And I was very struck by that. I said, "I don't understand what that means, but tell me more." And so that's how this got started. The story started because Julia came to me out of nowhere, this creation of my imagination, this dreamland visitor who told me that she had a story and I should follow her. And so I did. Um, that's how All That We See or Seem came to be, and it is a story about dreams fundamentally. So All That We See or Seem, just for listeners who don't know anything about this book, it's a techno thriller. I don't even know if I would call it sci-fi necessarily, because almost everything in it is already technically possible. It's just scaled up. So I sort of think of it as a realist techno thriller, really. And it's a future in which AI is ubiquitous, and AI has become a large part of the way we talk to each other, the way art is conducted, the way elections are conducted, the way everything on the web is done. Most of web traffic is AI talking to AI, and human participation is at a premium. And in fact, a lot of companies devote a lot of resources deploying AI to specifically filter out what is AI and let in what is human. That's a big part of what these companies do. Julia is a hacker with a very troubled past. Um, she lived a past in which her data was misused, and she was very much tormented because of the way the internet basically made her into a pariah. And now that she's done with that phase of her life, she has returned and tries to live a life of, normalcy. But of course, as in stories like this, the world will not leave her alone, and she's drawn into the search for a dream artist who has disappeared. And Ellie, this artist, is somebody who crafts dreams for a large audience, collective dreaming, I call it, um, using the help of AI. So, this is an artist who uses AI as a medium, as a tool to craft these beautiful collective emotional experiences for people, for an audience in this dream state. And somehow she has, you know, touched the wrong nerves and disappeared because of international criminals who do not like what she's doing. And then Julia has to figure out what happened and try to track her down. So that's as far as I will talk about the plot without spoiling anything. But it is a story that I had a lot of fun writing because it gave me a chance to put in all of my thoughts and speculations about the future of art, human art, in the age of AI, and in what ways AI will make us more human, and in which ways AI will make us less so. If there's anything to distinguish this story, I would say that it's very realistic, and it's not very much a dystopia. I try to tell a story that sort of views AI as a neutral tool. It will, in many ways, make us feel more human, and in many ways will be much worse. And there are choices we can make about how AI is used, deployed, trained, and so on and so forth that will determine those kind of futures.
Yeah, one thing I like is how it feels like AI is woven into the story in such a realistic manner. And it's almost just like an agency enhancer, which is what technology is for humans today, right? You wake up and you choose the type of day you want. You have like more opportunity to reach more people in the world and create more than you ever could 200 years ago. And you also have more opportunity to waste away your life, like, and be a passive person. And so it felt really like nuanced and realistic in that sense. Also, the title of the book, of course, there's this core element to the story around dreams. And the title of the book is referenced in Edgar Allan Poe's poem, A Dream Within a Dream. And I was curious why you kind of bridge that connection. It's an amazing title in its own right, even for people who don't know that.
Well, one of the things that I think a lot about is this sense of reality. What is reality? How do we know what is real, right? It turns out that that's actually a very difficult question because ultimately our consciousness is just a brain locked inside our skulls. Our brains cannot experience the universe except through sensorium. And not even directly in that case. Not only do we experience, these electrical impulses that come up the nerves, we also have to make sense of them by having a story about how the world functions, right? Our vision does not actually work as a literal translation of the signals. We do a lot of fill in the blank in our brains for vision and for hearing, for all of it. Our brains have these models, stories of how the universe works, and then we fill in the blank, which is why, visual illusions work, which is why auditory hallucinations happen, which is why so many ways that our perception is in fact not real. Um, AI in some ways is a way to sort of bring forth this irreality into sharp contrast, because it turns out that the way these neural networks represent data is very similar to the way our own brains does the representation. That's one of those deep insights that I find very troubling and also exciting to think about the fact that we are able to create this thing that imitates ourselves so well. It's a great way for us to study the way we do cognition, the way we think, the way our own minds actually work. And I find it really fascinating that, these models also don't know reality in any deep sense. I mean, a large language model may talk to you about your travel itinerary or about, you know, how to write your essay better, but it really has no understanding of any of this stuff. It really knows only language, only knows strings of symbols, which it constantly manipulates over and over again. But how is that different from humans? We are also fundamentally just doing the same thing. So it just gets into the cycle of reflecting our own sense of reality and what it is that we're really experiencing.
You touch on this idea of like, um, even Andre Karpathy has been speaking a lot about this recently, and it's sort of like shaking up, I feel like, the AI community a little, where he's like, they're not super intelligent. It's literally like predicting the next token, and it will be one day, but like, I don't know if this is architecture to necessarily get us there next year. It's probably 5-10 years away. Um, but I think there's just the idea of just like AI is just pattern matching, but then you look at our brains and we do have so much more context on the world and meaning and all of these things, but we still don't like actually understand where an idea comes from. There's some machine where we intake things and then things get spit out, right? So I don't know, maybe we're not better than an LLM.
It's this is such a hard question to answer, really, right? I mean, we're living in this strange moment where the technology is ahead of the science, right? These models are able to do things that we don't really fully understand, which is why when you read papers in the field, a deep sense of whiplash can sort of settle in, right? On the one hand, you have these papers coming out saying that, these LLMs are incredibly fragile. They're not really reasoning in a very deep sense. You can fool them by adding just a few extraneous details in mathematical problems. And now they're completely confused. They can't solve the math problem that they could just a moment ago. And in a way that humans are not tripped up. So there's something about these models that's incredibly fragile, and they really are just doing fancy pattern matching. Okay, great. So you feel like you have some understanding. Now you read a different paper. Now, this is another paper that says, okay, here's what we've done. We have examined these neural networks and tried to sort of understand and trace through what's happening as it processes a request. And it's eerie, but we're finding nodes and structures inside these neural networks that are reminiscent of human brains. So in some deep sense, these models are doing things that are quite deep, not merely, pattern matching. And maybe in some sense, our brains are doing something similar. And now you're like, whoa, now my understanding has been completely turned upside down. These both of these are true. How can they both be true? And it's very, very unsettling. And the fact that people, who are very skilled and knowledgeable are arguing over how to interpret these results is perhaps unsettling, but it's also very exciting. It means that we are really making deep discoveries. And I keep on going back to the fact that, yes, it's true that these chatbots are relatively simplistic, but the fact that these simplistic things can do such sophisticated results is deeply interesting, right? Either it means that our linguistic output has deep structure and intelligence in it, that we're now just sort of uncovering those patterns by using this machine, or it means that there are other things that these neural networks are doing that are interesting. Like I was mentioning earlier, the fact that the way these neural networks train to recognize faces represent the latent space of faces in a way that's mathematically very similar to how our brains do it. To me, that's an incredible bit of discovery and insight. It really shook me quite deeply to think about how the representation of these things can be, can be so similar in such different substrata, and how are we doing this? So
Totally.
anyway, I find it very fascinating.
And just to bring that example back to like our earliest conversation when we were talking about natural intelligence, like even the human brain's ability to read a face, there's crazy studies they've done in like social psychology field around if you were to look at all these different faces and and predict the success of this graduating class of lawyers at Harvard or whatever it is, it's like it's really abnormally correct. The human body and the human brain, it's like the best machine in the world and we don't even know how to build it. We're building humanoid robots, like people who work in that field believe this more than anything. Like it is just so hard to replicate the things we do with our body that we don't have to think about. So we're almost like V1 of everything. It makes sense that things sort of like mimic our processes because it's a miracle that we exist the way we do. Um, Another theme in the book is privacy, because like Julia Z, her data was misused and she wanted to be this invisible person. I'm curious how you think about privacy, because it seems like we're at this moment where so many people don't value it, right?
I think privacy is actually a very bad framework for thinking about these questions because privacy, legally, the right to privacy evolved in a very peculiar manner, and it's a combination of a lot of very disparate considerations and ethical claims sort of put under the heading of privacy, which is why I think it often confuses discussion rather than clarifying it. Just because of the way the Anglo American legal system decided to deal with the right of privacy in a particular way, it has shaped how a lot of us talk about it. And then I think oftentimes the legal sense of privacy is not really the right way to think about a lot of these issues. So I prefer to do it through a different lens, which is a sense of control about data about yourself, which is different from the right of privacy. Um, I so Julia Z, if you read the book, she relies on a personal AI extensively, and this is an AI trained on her own behavior, on her own data, on her own preferences, and the way she solves problems. And she calls this AI Talos, and she uses it extensively in her own life. And she sort of thinks of it as a way to collaborate with herself, because Talos really is basically an instantiation of her own mental patterns. So, a way for her to amplify herself. Now, what is interesting about this is she contrasts this with the way other people use their personal AIs. Other people largely rely on what's called a subscription personal AI, meaning in exchange for giving up all your personal data or control of your personal data to a large cloud company. So envision something like Meta or Google or whatever. They will in exchange provide you with personal AI service. So they train themselves on your data and they give you this personal AI service. And, it's obvious that control over your data is one of the primary reasons they offer the service. Then, in exchange for knowing everything about you, which is incredibly valuable information, they provide you the service, but in exchange you have to give up all your data to them. And Julia absolutely despises that, and so she trains her own AI, and her AI is run locally, and she does not use cloud services. I think the contrast between these two is very telling, and it's very important to think about, because the difference between them is not so much privacy in the sense of who sees your data, but rather control. It's about control. It's about control. It's about control of your own image, about control of your performance. It's about control over who you are and how you think about yourself. I think this is where I would argue that the way we think about technology policy has been very, very flawed. We sort of think about tech regulation as a matter of serving the interests of industry and commerce. We think of it in explicitly geopolitical terms, in terms of national competitiveness, and so on and so forth. I think this is such a horribly flawed way of thinking about tech regulation. What we really need to think about is all the other components of a healthy technological ecosystem. For example, we need to have a healthy tech commons. We need to protect the right of people to control their own data, data portability, data control. We need to think about all the ways in which knowledge, sharing of knowledge, and reverse engineering should not be criminalized. These are incredibly important because these are interests that are just as important as the concerns of industry and commercial entities. But they often have no powerful advocates behind them. There's no billion-dollar company built on the idea of a tech commons. Um, but the commons is incredibly important because without the commons, we would not have these alternative data models like the ones that Julia Z relies on. You need to have a healthy commons. You need to have a healthy regulatory regime that allows people to retain control over their own data. You need to have open hardware, open uh, 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 knowledge about highly technical information so that people can build them outside of the control of commercial entities. So I think, we need to think about tech regulation and tech um, legislation as a matter for citizens, not for industry. It's very important for us to take away this discussion about how tech regulation ought to work away from this contest between so-called individuals versus Silicon Valley. I don't think that's the right framework. We got to think about all of these other things: the tech commons, alternative tech models, alternative data models, tech control, data control, and ultimately tech regulation need to serve the interests of citizens, not industry.
That's very interesting. Do you think Europe is doing it better than the US? Because Europe seems to value the individual's control over their data a lot more than America. But I mean, a lot of people are giving Europe a lot of flack for their regulation and feel like they're pushing out the tech companies because it's becoming
I
just too hard to operate with those.
I would argue that the way Europe is doing regulation is incredibly counterproductive. They are not what they're valuing is the right of bureaucrats to control things rather than the right of actual individuals. They're regulating for the sake of the regulatory state, not for the sake of individual citizens, not for the tech commons, not for the health of democracy, not for any of the things that I value here. The way Europe has enacted tech regulation seems to have all the horrible aspects of a bureaucratic state without any of the benefits of a vibrant industry the
Mm.
way that we have done so. So, no, I don't think Europe has done a better job. In fact, if anything, I would argue Europe is the exact opposite of the model I would advocate for.
um, and last question on all that we see or seem is, I don't know if you write this way where you hope that there are certain questions or ideas or values people walk away with, but um I guess what if you do it all, like what are the questions or the broader concepts that you hope readers finish beyond just like an amazing, escape and entertaining story?
I hope that people will end up with interesting questions that they want to ask themselves, right? So questions like, what does it mean to have art in the age of AI, right? Do I care that a piece of art is created by a human or not? And if I don't, why not? What do I value in art? I want people to ask questions about what is what kind of uses of AI will make me feel more human, and what kind of uses of AI will make me feel less so, and how do I get to that point? Like, I don't like the idea of training an AI on everything I do if that data is going to be controlled by a company. But I do like the idea of doing that if I can control all of that myself. And is it possible to make these things easy so that most people would actually do it rather than just the technical elite? I think these are interesting questions for people to think about. Mainly, I want people to think about the mythology of technology and AI, because fundamentally, all good fiction, all good fantastical fiction is really about mythological experiences. You know, Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, and the specific technical details of what she wrote, those are not correct and those are not relevant to today. But the fundamental mythological figure of the creature, that is incredibly relevant to us today. We still invoke the creature every time we talk about technology, we talk about something new. Frankenstein's monster, the creature, comes out. So I would hope that people can read, all that we see or seem, and see all the mythological figures I've created: the dream guide, the Oneiro effects, the
That's
idea
such
of
an
Julia Z
amazing idea,
herself.
by the way. I hope that that becomes a thing.
I hope so too. So that's what I hope. I hope the
Yeah.
mythology of the story stays with people. That's what I care about.
Yeah. Um, well, Ken, it's been really such a pleasure to have you on the show and to have this conversation. So I just can't thank you enough for taking the time to be here. Everyone should definitely go buy your new book. And I really look forward to watching everything you keep doing. Like, I think you're existing between like so many interesting worlds, both in the literary world and also in the technology world. I know how many people um, read your work and really use it as a way to like start imagining how AI is thread into our world. And in San Francisco, it comes up a lot. And yeah, I'm just very grateful for everything you're working on. So thank you.
Thank you, Sabrina. This has been such a pleasure.